It's no secret that Dragon Age The Veilguard has failed to meet the expectations of EA. It now makes its way to the PS Plus catalog just a mere 4 months after the game's release back in October, setting what I think might be a new record. The only other game I can really think of making a quick turnaround to that service being Immortals of Avium, which I found to be pretty decent. Now the real question remains that if Dragon Age The Veilguard really is that bad. Like every game that exists on this planet, there is some good and there is some bad, and honestly, Veilguard is really no different. I wanted to go back and revisit the Veilguard and give my updated thoughts. See, my initial playthrough was around 60 hours. In it, I completed a variety of side quests, companion quests, and even wrapped up the main quest, and it's safe to say that I gave the game a thorough playthrough. Now in this video, I'll share my thoughts on the game as a whole, and I'll be starting with everything that I liked and transitioning into the things that I did not like at all, and whether or not I recommend this game to you. So let's get started. Now the game has some very good customization options for your rook. You can of course pick from 4 different lineages, being the elf, Qunari, human, and dwarf, and 3 classes, the rogue, mage, and warrior. These options are pretty much par for the course as far as the Dragon Age series goes, and you can also pick from 6 different backstories, and these kind of set up your dialogue options, what kind of buffs you get in combat, and which faction you'll kind of gain a faster rep with. Now the character creator does let you make some good looking characters with all the different sliders, from the hair options, the beard, the makeup, and pretty much everything in between. I tried to go for an evil wizard type character, and while I don't think I achieved that completely, the game does have a good character creator with plenty of options to make a character that you'll eventually like. What I also really liked was the ability to customize the difficulty. This is a huge part of being accessible to a larger audience. I like the options available here because you're able to really tailor your experience. You can change the enemy damage output, health, aggression, resistances, and how much exploration help you get throughout the game. Now, I started on underdog difficulty, which is just 1 level below the highest, and after finishing my playthrough, I definitely recommend using these gameplay modifiers for certain parts like enemy health in future playthroughs, because enemies can get extremely spongy towards the end of the game, which I'll cover a bit later. Gone are the days of just holding the right trigger and waiting for enough mana to cast an ability. Combat now is much more fast, fluid, testing your reaction, your skills, especially on the higher difficulties. It has a lot more of an action RPG feel to it than a tactical one. Now, playing as a mage was very fun. I felt powerful, my spells looked devastating, and I mainly focused on being a store mage with my lightning abilities ranging from large AoE attacks to high single target damage. The feeling of pulling off an AoE attack followed by chain lightning to overwhelm enemies was incredibly satisfying. Now you also have 2 companions alongside you in battle, down from the 3 in Inquisition, but I found that 2 were more than enough. The new combo system lets you combine abilities with your allies, basically applying status effects, then detonating them. These combos are crucial at higher difficulties, and combat can definitely get drawn out against elite enemies or bosses, especially since difficulty does scale up enemy health pools. But overall, I think it's safe to say that I really enjoyed Veilguard's combat. I also really like being able to specialize my companions to complement my playstyle. See, each companion basically has their own archetype. Davrin, for example, plays the role of a tank, where Lucanus is more of a damage dealer. I could pick their skills to build them in ways that worked well with my rook. Since I was a mage constantly getting chased by enemies, I improved Davrin's taunt ability to make it cover a larger area and last 25% longer. This opened up combat for me quite a bit, allowing me to deal damage from a safe distance. If you're playing on higher difficulties, team composition becomes crucial to your strategy. Now, Veilguard does have this system where if a party member constantly disapproves of your choices, they become hardened, which limits their skill growth potential and worsens their opinion of you. This makes your decisions have consequences within your party, and looking back, only Nev became hardened in my playthrough because I chose to help Lucanus save Treviso rather than helping her save Minrathous. This hardened status lasted pretty much the whole game, and it was a nice system that added weight to the decisions that I'm making. One thing I really liked about the level and world design was how it rewarded exploration. What makes or breaks a semi-open world game for me is whether they're going off the beaten path is worth it, and thankfully Veilguard definitely makes it worthwhile. There are a lot of codex entries for lore, hidden chests with new armor and weapons, mementos to level up the caretaker back at your base, and valuables to sell at faction merchants for reputation. This makes everything worth picking up. I was so trained to check every corner of every room that sometimes I didn't fully appreciate how good the areas actually looked. One thing this game also has are quest summaries, which quickly became one of my favorite quality of life features. After every quest, you get a written summary of what just happened. This was super helpful for longer quests where I might forget why I was even on that quest to begin with. There's also a dedicated screen recapping everything about the main quest and your companion's story. I found this really helpful and definitely would like to see more games incorporate something like this. The world reacts to your choices beyond companion approval. Best example was choosing between saving Minrathous or Treviso. Since I chose to save Treviso, this left Minrathous under Venatori control instead of the Shadow Dragons faction. I liked seeing these consequences play out, making my decisions felt like they had weight. Honestly, I just wish there was way more of these types of choices throughout the game because there's very little of them, which I'll also be covering a little bit later. Now, I think the skill tree is very well done. It is a bit overwhelming at first. Now, as a mage, I did have 3 different specializations to choose from. I decided to focus in on the storm abilities for burst damage and my AoE attacks. Being able to rain lightning down from the sky and follow up with chain lightning was incredibly satisfying. The best part about this was that I could refund all my skill points at any time and switch up my playstyle, which I did do once or twice just to try out everything and keep the gameplay fresh. I was kind of impressed with how some side quests actually close loops on characters I never expected to see again. For example, early in the game I encountered a mayor who sold his city out to the elven god Gillenane for power. I left him trapped in the Blight to die, thinking that was basically the end of his story. But a side quest hours later had me facing him as a Blight mutated monster. This happened with other NPCs too, which showed a nice attention to storytelling detail. Now, the fast travel system and the map interface are among the most intuitive I've ever seen. The UI clearly shows all the locations you visited with relevant information on the same screen. Hovering over a location shows all the available quests in that region. Once you fast travel, there is a beacon system within these regions that makes navigating a breeze. Many big RPGs have clunky interfaces that make tracking quests cumbersome, but Veilguard makes the whole game easy to navigate. Now let's talk about the loot system. Initially, I was pretty disappointed with the loot, but it grew on me as the game progressed. At first, the gear seemed uninteresting and didn't alter gameplay much. Veilguard does have that standard rarity system from common to legendary, plus unique items that are the strongest in the game. As I progressed, I did start finding more interesting gear with perks that ended up changing my playstyle. For example, I found a staff that applied burning stacks to enemies, then gear that added additional burning stacks, and finally a unique item that converted my fire resistance into fire damage bonus. See, the interplay between these items is fun, and these combinations feel very well thought out. Your companions also have equipment that can align with your build, like items that apply status effects or do more damage against taunted enemies. The library tab contains a wealth of information about the Dragon Age world. It's one of the best lore repositories I've seen in any game. You can learn about different factions, companions, and there's a whole glossary dedicated to the world of Dragon Age. I enjoyed browsing through this in between my quests. Now quickly, I'll cover side content. There's no shortage of that. Probably around 80 hours if you're going for 100% completion. I had around 70% completed when I finished my first playthrough, and remember, I put about 60 hours into the game. Now, each region does have side quests to help you gain reputation with the local faction, unlocking better gear. There are also small puzzles with rewards like permanent health upgrades or skill points. One side quest line that I particularly enjoyed involved cleaning up corruption in the Crossroads, which had me fighting world bosses and culminated in a huge final battle. Now, one of the main complaints about the game was that companion quests weren't tied to the main story. I actually liked that they weren't tied to the main story. See, each companion has their own personal issues and motivations that separate them from the main plot. The game warned you before the final battle that companions who haven't resolved their personal issues might falter against Elganar and Gillenane, which made me pause to make sure my team was as prepared as they could be. Now, most companions were enjoyable to quest with, though a couple I didn't bother helping at all, and to be honest, they did not survive that final showdown. Now, the companion quests were pretty well done because they opened up completely new areas that were big, they were fleshed out with levels that even have their own secrets. Some of the best items as far as loot goes were found in these areas, like in a huge dwarven mine during Harding's quest, for example. These quests also include interesting boss fights. I especially like the battle against the Gloomhowler in Davrin's storyline and against Zara in Lucanus' quest. Now, the importance of completing companion quests became clear at the end of the game, and I kind of touched on this a bit earlier, but when everything comes together in a huge rush at the end of the game, your previous decisions really do matter. Did I do enough for my companions to survive? Did I help them out to overcome their issues? Did I gain enough support from all these different factions? The companions that I neglected weren't prepared for the final assignments and actually died trying to complete them. I like that the game puts an importance on being a leader and preparing your party. The final act was really good. Every decision I made was scrutinized, and any unresolved storyline increased the probability of things going wrong. Factions I didn't help weren't as committed as those that I invested time in. Seeing companions succeed or fall at their missions really drove home the consequences of my choices. That final fight with Elganar was interesting enough, though I never found Elganar and Gillenane particularly compelling as villains. The game does have multiple endings, including a secret one. I ended up getting what would be considered the good ending. Now, of course, I have to mention that the world in Veilguard is absolutely stunning. The environments look amazing with towering castles, cityscapes, and mountain ranges visible from a distance. Cities feel alive, and merchant stalls and NPCs are having conversations about current events. The diverse biomes are well crafted, and the environmental storytelling is excellent. You can walk around and get a sense of what happened before your arrival. Graphically, the game just looks stellar. I also really liked how the companions interacted with each other at the lighthouse base. They had conversations, they helped each other, and sometimes argued. For example, Emmerich helped Harding figure out what was happening with their possession, while Davrin and Lucanus didn't get along because Lucanus was possessed by a demon named Spite, and Davrin, as a Grey Warden, is suspicious of him. These dynamics make the companions feel like real people rather than just NPCs who accompany you on quests, and sometimes they even form romances with one another. And to finally wrap up the things that I did like, the sound design deserves some praise too. The voice acting is excellent, with actors playing their roles perfectly. The writing itself isn't great. The voice acting quality is high, however, and the music does a great job of building atmosphere in these different situations. So those are the things that I enjoyed about Dragon Age The Veilguard. I'm going to switch gears here and talk about the things I did not like. So let's get started. The Qunari redesign is terrible. They looked fine before, they looked unique and different from everything else in the Dragon Age world. The new design just makes their faces look too human with randomly sprouting horns. I considered playing as a Qunari, but just couldn't bring myself to do it after seeing the options available. The villains in the game are just weak and generic. It's kind of ironic that the whole story happens because we stopped Solus from destroying the Veil, but in doing so, we let two elven gods escape, causing even more death and destruction. Elganar and Gillenane are the run-of-the-mill bad guys who want to control the world using blight. I was hoping for something more nuanced, but their motivations and stories are just so predictable. It's a story I've seen many times without any unique twists. The lip syncing is noticeably off. With today's technology, I expected better facial expressions and lip syncing, and this stands out in a game with so much dialogue. The game has these countless pointless interactions like moving objects short distances to build bridges or open doors, and these felt like completely unnecessary time wasters that don't add anything to the game. Every time I encountered one, I wondered why it existed at all. Were they remnants of larger puzzles that ended up getting shortened and cut, or is it just here to pad some playtime? This one really ended up surprising me because unlike previous Dragon Age games, you can't directly control your companions. This seems like a design choice based on player behavior in previous games, but I thought it was a serious staple to switch to your allies at any time in combat. You can still command your companions to use abilities, but there's no tactics menu to set up how they should behave in combat, when to use certain abilities, or when to heal you. It would have been nice if they automatically used abilities based on the settings you chose. So the game definitely loses a good amount of depth in its combat by taking away what previous games had and executed with very well. Another strange thing is that companions just don't take any damage. They don't even have health bars and are essentially immortal. They react to getting hit, but it doesn't affect them at all. This obviously streamlines combat quite a bit because you don't have to worry about your companions going down in combat and reviving them, but overall it just feels odd. During long fights, companions really only offer one ability about every 30 seconds. Their regular damage is somewhat negligible. Unless I was using Davrin's taunt, they rarely ever held aggro, forcing me as a mage to run around until taunt was available once again. Essentially what this boils down to is that it makes your companions nothing more than just an extra ability slot to use whenever the cooldown is up. Now, the puzzles are hilariously easy, possibly the easiest I've seen in any game. I often questioned if I was missing something, but I never was. It's okay to have challenging puzzles with hints from companions if a player gets stuck, like God of War for example. Enemy variety is surprisingly limited for such a big game. You repeatedly fight the same Darkspawn, demons, Antom, and Venatori. Different versions of these enemies are just stat upgrades rather than new challenges. I recently played Jedi Survivor, which introduced new enemy types almost every mission. Unfortunately, in Veilguard, what you see within the first 10 to 15 hours is what you'll see for the rest of the game. And it definitely gets boring fighting these same enemies over and over again for upwards of 80 hours if you do intend to play the game completely through. Not only is there not enough enemy variety, the enemy attack patterns lack variety as well. Antom attacks similarly to the Venatori, and demons use the same range attacks as other enemy types. There is really no need for different strategies against different groups. Some enemies have barriers or armor, but they're largely dealt with in the same way. At higher difficulties, enemies become way too spongy. See, I started on underdog difficulty, but found that encounters, especially against the elite enemies, took so long that I got burnt out on the combat. I eventually ended up lowering the difficulty down a notch just to make it so that the enemy health is more tolerable and that fights would progress quicker. I think my biggest complaint for me was that you just can't play as an evil character, which is strange for a game where choices supposedly matter. There is no evil playthrough or ending where you side with the villains. The dialogue options are always positive, sarcastic, or stern, but never truly mean or evil. I wanted to roleplay as an evil wizard coming out of retirement, but my character was always optimistic and trying to make the right choices. BioWare games typically allow this. Mass Effect has the pure renegade shepherd who is a complete maniac, but Veilguard doesn't even get you anywhere remotely close to behaving like a real evil character. To add to that, impactful choices are very few and far between, especially early on. The Treviso Manrathis decision was one of the few that significantly changed the outcome and affected companion relationships. Most decisions that you make throughout the game feel somewhat insignificant until the very final act, where your choices suddenly end up mattering a lot. Another small complaint from me, but every time you talk to Solus, there's this blinding white screen transition before and after. Playing in a dark room at night, these transitions felt like a flashbang and forced me to look away. The skill tree doesn't tell you what type of abilities you have. There are nodes that upgrade blast abilities or strike abilities, but the game doesn't indicate which of your chosen abilities falls into these categories. You have to exit the skill tree, check your abilities, then return to decide if the node is worth picking. There is definitely room for a quality of life improvement. This UI can be improved by communicating more information to what our current loadout looks like. Now, I think there's a lot of debate over this, but in my opinion, the player models just don't look good. They appear like animated cartoon characters from a 3D movie. The game would have benefited from a more realistic approach given its tone and vibe. While the environments look amazing, the character models just never grew on me. The dialogue options are extremely disappointing. As I mentioned earlier, you can't play as a mean-spirited person who just dislikes everyone. Instead, you're forced into the role of a caring leader. Even the mean options aren't harsh at all. The worst part about it is that the dialogue descriptions often don't really match up with what your character actually says. For example, selecting the option to tell someone to shut up results in a much milder response. To add to that, the writing is often bland, making it hard to relate or to even like my own character. It's unclear when companions will approve or disapprove of your choices. It seems random. You'll make many dialogue choices with no reaction at all from anyone in your party, then suddenly a companion will approve or disapprove of something for reasons that really aren't that obvious. So those are the things I like and dislike about Dragon Age The Veilguard. My final opinion lands on this game being decent. It ends up being a world that is worth spending some time in. I wouldn't rate it amongst any of my favorite Dragon Age games. I think it's definitely a huge step back for the series in terms of its depth, quality of writing, and choice making, but it definitely has some plus sides. I really liked the combat quite a bit. The skill system was pretty well done, and the world design is just beautiful. Honestly, if you're playing this game for free on PS Plus, then you might as well give the game a shot. You never know, you might end up really liking it. For me, I bought the game on release, spending the $70, of course, and I did get my 60 hours out of it, so I did enjoy my time with it. I wished it was a little bit better, but it is what it is. So that's gonna wrap up this video about Dragon Age The Veilguard. Thank you all for watching as always. I'll see you all in the next one.